The widow's hands had stopped trembling 3 minutes ago, but her boots had not moved an inch. She stood in the center of Hardin Creek's only street on a Tuesday in November of 1884, with the wind coming down off the Bitterroot Range hard enough to lean against, and every soul in that town was watching her. Not discreetly, not with the courtesy of a sideways glance. They were watching her the way men watch a fire that has not yet decided which direction to spread. She did not look at any of them. She was looking at the man standing 15 feet away on the jailhouse steps with a rifle across his forearm and the expression of someone who had been asked a question he had no intention of answering. The name she'd given the deputy was Nora Payne. The papers she'd unfolded from her coat pocket said she was the new deputy for Hardin Creek County, appointed in writing by the territory marshal whose name carried the legal weight of God in 3 states. The man with the rifle said nothing at all. He just looked at her. Then he looked at the paper. Then he looked at her again. Then he asked, "Can you fight?" If this story has already taken hold of you, if you already know this woman is going to show this town something it will not forget, subscribe to this channel right now and stay with me until the very end. Drop the name of your city or town in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. Now come back with me 11 days earlier, to the morning Nora Payne boarded a stage in Missoula with a marshal's badge sewn into the lining of her coat and a decision in her chest that she had not yet permitted herself to fully examine. She was 34 years old. She had been widowed for 7 months. Her husband, Deputy Emmett Payne, had been shot in the back on a Tuesday in April while returning from a prisoner transfer, and the man who shot him had walked into Hardin Creek's saloon that same evening and ordered a whiskey and told the story as though he'd done something worth telling. The territory marshal had come to see her 3 weeks after the burial. He sat at her kitchen table and turned his hat around in his hands and said he needed someone who could go where his men could not, into homes, into back rooms, into the places that locked their doors when a badge showed up on horseback. He said he needed someone people would underestimate. He did not say it cruelly. He said it with the precision of a man who had thought it through carefully before he opened his mouth. Nora had known her own body her entire life. She was a large woman, had been since childhood, would be until she died, and had arrived at a private peace with that fact somewhere around her 22nd year when she'd understood that other people's discomfort was their problem to carry, not hers. She was tall. She was broad through the shoulder. She moved through a room the way heavy weather moved, deliberately, fully, taking up exactly the space required. She had worked a ranch for 11 years. Her hands were calloused. Her back was straight. She told the marshal yes. The stage driver's name was August Briggs. He was 61 years old, missing the ring finger on his right hand from a rope accident, and he delivered her everything she needed to know about Hardin Creek before the wheels had turned a mile out of Missoula. "Sheriff Walt Greer," he said, without being asked, "runs that town like he owns the mineral rights to it, which some folks say he does, through the back end of a claim he shouldn't still be holding. You ask me, the shooting of your husband wasn't random. You ask me, there's a reason the man who did it walked free in 6 hours." He glanced at her once, sideways. "You the widow?" "I'm the deputy," Nora said. He looked at her the way men looked when they had already decided a thing could not be true and were attempting to revise that decision in real time. "I don't mean offense, ma'am. I know," she said. "You won't be the last." The stage rolled for 6 hours through the November mountains. The cold came down from the high country in layers, pressing through the wool of her coat 1 degree at a time. She watched the territory go from open valley to canyon, from yellow grass to gray rock, from wide sky to the narrow corridor of a river she did not know the name of. Somewhere in that last hour, while the light went copper and the peaks went white, she pressed the heel of her hand against the badge sewn into her lining and held it there until the stage began its descent into Hardin Creek. The town was smaller than she'd been told. One long main street, a saloon, a general store, a jailhouse built from riverstone, a church at the far end with a broken weather vane turning in the wind. November had stripped every tree to bone. The whole place looked like it was waiting for something unpleasant, and had been waiting for some time. She stepped down from the stage with her one trunk and her document case, and she felt the town turn and look. She had felt it her whole life. That long, slow measuring look that started at the head and traveled down, the kind that took inventory rather than offered greeting. She was aware of it the way she was aware of weather, as information, not wound. A woman near the general store said something behind her hand to the woman beside her. Nora heard her own name, though she had told it to no one yet. Then she heard laughter, brief, not particularly quiet. Nora Payne picked up her trunk and walked toward the jailhouse without altering her pace by a single step. Sheriff Walt Greer was 49 years old and had the look of a man who had spent 30 years ensuring that nothing surprised him. He was lean in the way that hunger makes a person lean, not from discipline, but from appetites spent in other directions. He stood on the jailhouse steps when she came up the street. He had been told clearly that a deputy was coming. He looked at the paper she handed him for 11 seconds. Then, he handed it back. "You're the cook," he said. "From what I understand, the territorial government has confused the assignment." "Nora Payne," she said. "Deputy, by appointment of Marshal Creighton Hale. The document is signed, dated, and witnessed. I bake, I cook, and I keep a clean kitchen if one is required. But I was sent here in a legal capacity, Sheriff, and I intend to serve in one." He looked at her for a long moment, not at the document, at her. Then he asked it, "Can you fight?" The street had gone quiet. She was not certain when. But she was aware, without looking, that there were 11 people within earshot, and that not one of them was pretending to do something else. "What I can do," Nora said, "is gather evidence, conduct witness interviews, identify patterns in financial records, and testify in a territory court without my voice shaking. What I can do is walk into a situation that your men cannot enter without the doors closing, and return with what you need to open them." She held his gaze without effort. "Whether I can fight is a question that will answer itself. The more relevant question is whether you are going to make this different, because I have driven 6 hours through the Bitterroot cold, and I would prefer to conduct our disagreements indoors." Greer studied her for 4 more seconds. Then, he stepped aside. The jailhouse was 2 rooms, the front office with a desk and a cold stove, and a back room with 2 cells and a cot that had not been properly slept in. The deputy's desk was pushed into a corner and used as a shelf. There was a wanted board on the wall with notices tacked in no particular order, some of them 6 months old. A coffee pot sat on the stove with something in it that had ceased being coffee in a previous administration. Nora set her document case on the deputy's desk and began clearing it. Greer leaned in the doorway and watched her. "The marshal didn't say you were a woman," he said. "The marshal," she said, without turning, "didn't say you'd object." He left before she could respond to the sound of his boots on the boards, and she stood alone in the empty jailhouse with the cold stove and the outdated notices and the coffee pot full of whatever had once been coffee. She looked at the wanted board for 2 minutes. Then, she sat down at the desk she had cleared and opened her document case and began to work. She had 6 days before the situation forced her hand. In those 6 days, she did what she had been sent to do. she walked the town. She talked to the women first, the laundress, the schoolteacher, the wife of the man who ran the general store, because women kept the actual accounts of a town's life. They knew which men owed which debts. They knew which properties had changed hands in ways that did not appear in any official record. They knew, 3 of them independently, that the man who had shot Emmett Payne had been in Walt Greer's jailhouse the morning of the shooting and had been released without a charge before the noon meal. She ate at the boarding house table with the miners and the freighters. She said little and listened with the full surface of her attention. On the 4th day, a man named Clyde Tibbett sat down across from her and said, without preamble, that Walt Greer had received 14% of the proceeds from a silver claim he had no legal right to, and that the claim had been taken from a man named Harlan Price through forged transfer documents, and that Harlan Price had been the man who had told Emmett Payne about it 8 months ago. Tibbett was 57 years old. He had 2 daughters in Missoula and hands that had not stopped shaking since his wife died. He pushed a folded piece of paper across the table without looking at her. Then he stood up and said, quietly, "I know I'm not supposed to be telling you this. You're telling the right person." He nodded once, the way old men nod when they are not sure whether they have done a good thing or a dangerous one, and went back to his food. That night, alone at the deputy's desk with a lantern burning down to its last 1/4 inch of oil, Nora laid out everything she had gathered across the surface of the financial records from the county clerk, whose name was Sandra Hollis, and who had handed them over with the expression of someone who had been waiting for exactly this request. The testimonies she had taken in writing from 3 women, and Tibbett, and a former mine assayer who had been run out of town the previous spring. The deed transfer documents, 2 of them, with signatures she had compared side by side for 20 minutes before she was certain. The cold came through the jailhouse walls, and she did not stop to feed the stove. She worked until the lantern died. Then she sat in the dark for a moment, with her hands flat on the papers, and breathed. She thought about Emmett, the way she sometimes thought about him at the end of a long day. Not the grief of it, which she had stopped trying to outrun, but the specific fact of him. His voice, the way he had always sat on the edge of the bed in the morning to pull on his boots, always the left one first, always with the same 3-second pause before standing. He had been a quiet man, a fair man. He had told her once, laughing slightly, that he had married her because she was the most competent person he had ever met, and he intended to spend his life learning from her. She thought about that for 20 seconds in the dark jailhouse. Then she picked up the papers and put them in order. On the 6th day, Walt Greer came to find her. He did not come to the jailhouse. He came to the boarding house before breakfast with 2 men she recognized as the ones who rotated on his payroll in a manner that appeared on no official schedule. He asked Mrs. Holden, the boarding house owner, to send Nora down. Mrs. Holden was 64 years old and had lived in Hardin Creek for 31 years. She came upstairs and knocked on Nora's door and said, in a voice carefully pitched so that it would not carry, "He's in the front room. His men are at the door. I want you to know I have a shotgun in the pantry, and I know how to use it." Nora looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," she said. She came downstairs with her document case under her arm and her coat already buttoned. Greer was standing by the window with his hat on and his hands at his sides. The 2 men at the door were trying to look casual. They were not succeeding. "The territorial appointment has been reviewed," Greer said, "and there are questions about its validity." "There are no questions about its validity," she said. "There are, however, a significant number of questions about a forged deed transfer executed in this county in 1882. and those questions are going to be answered in a territory court within the next 30 days. She set the document case on the parlor table. Or they can be answered now, with Marshall Hale on the road from Missoula and a full arrest, which is what happens if you put your hands on me, or this case. The room held its breath. Greer's jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes, not fear, exactly, but the recognition of a situation that had already moved past the point where he could reverse it. He had expected her to be manageable. She had arrived 11 days ago and become unmanageable in 6. "You have no witnesses," he said. "I have 4, she said. "And a retired assayer in Billings who has copies of the original survey documents and has been waiting since last spring for someone to ask him about them." Silence. From the back of the parlor, Mrs. Holden's voice, "Walt Greer, I have fed you breakfast in this house for 19 years. Get out of my parlor." The courthouse was not a large building, but it was full. It was full because word travels in a small town in the winter the way cold travels, through every crack and gap into every room. It was full because people who had said nothing for 2 years had been waiting, in the quiet private way that decent people wait, for someone to say it first. It was full because Clyde Tibbett was there, and Sandra Hollis, and 3 women who had been careful for a long time and were careful no longer, and Harlan Price himself, who had traveled 112 miles from where Greer had managed to put him, for the express purpose of looking the man in the face, one final time in public. Marshall Creighton Hale sat at the front table. The territory judge, who had arrived the previous afternoon and spent the night at Mrs. Holden's and eaten her biscuits with the expression of a man who had not eaten properly in weeks, occupied the raised bench. Walt Greer sat at the defendant's table and did not look at Nora. Nora stood before the room and presented what she had gathered. She did not perform it. She read it the way she read everything, steadily, clearly, with no ornamentation. The deed transfer, the financial records, the 4 testimonies, each read in full. The assayer's documentation, which had arrived by courier the previous morning, and which she had read twice in the lamplight before she slept. It took 51 minutes. When she finished, the room was so quiet she could hear the weather vane on the distant church turning. The judge said, "Sheriff Greer, do you have a response to the evidence presented?" Greer looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He said nothing for 14 seconds. Marshall Hale stood up. "I'll take it from here, Your Honor," he said. He crossed to the defendant's table in 4 steps. He said to Greer, in a voice that carried to every corner of that room, "Walt Greer, I am placing you under arrest for the corruption of a peace officer, the fraudulent transfer of mineral claims, and conspiracy in the killing of Deputy Emmett Payne." He set his hands on Greer's shoulders and looked at Nora across the room. Deputy Payne. Good work. Every head in that room turned. Not all of them had known her husband's name. Now, they did. A man near the back, a miner, silver-haired, who had kept his face carefully neutral for 11 days, took his hat off and held it against his chest. Then the woman beside him did something similar with the hand she'd been gripping her own coat with. And then, from somewhere Nora could not quite locate, a sound that was not applause exactly, but was adjacent to it moved through the room like weather. She stood at the front of that courthouse and took it without moving. Not from pride. Not from performance. She simply did not know yet what to do with a room full of people who were looking at her the right way, and so she stood still and let them look. That evening, Mrs. Holden made a pot of beef stew and set it on the boarding house table without being asked, and Nora sat down to it alone at first, and then not alone. because Clyde Tibbet sat down across from her with his hat in his lap and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Your husband was a good man." And she said, "He was," and that was all either of them needed to say about it. The stew was thick with root vegetables, and something in it that was either thyme or sage, and it was the first hot meal she had eaten sitting down since Missoula. She ate slowly. She listened to the boarding house settle around her in the cold, the particular language of timber and stone that old buildings speak at the end of a day, the creak and shift that sounds like complaint, but is actually just the sound of something that has survived. Sandra Hollis came by after supper with a bottle of something amber and 2 glasses, and sat across from Nora at the cleared table, and poured without asking permission. "The Harlan Price claim will take time to restore properly," Sandra said. "There are 3 other properties I've been watching for 6 months that have similar irregularities. Not as urgent. But they're there." Nora looked at her. "Show me," she said. They worked for 2 hours. The lamp burned well. Outside, the Bitterroot wind pressed against the walls of Mrs. Holden's boarding house in the way the wind does in November in Montana, not cruelly but thoroughly, testing every edge, finding every gap, certain of its own permanence and merely curious about yours. When Sandra left, Nora stayed at the table for a while longer with her hands around the empty glass and the papers spread before her in the lamplight. The badge, which she had taken from the coat lining and pinned properly that morning for the first time, caught the light when she moved. She did not think about the question he had asked on the courthouse steps 11 days ago, because it had answered itself. She did not think about what came next, because what came next was tomorrow, and tomorrow was already full of things that needed doing and people who needed someone to do them. She thought about Emmett for exactly 30 seconds. The left boot first, the 3-second pause. Then she folded the papers and put them away and went to bed. In the morning she rose at 5 o'clock, as she always had, and dressed in the dark, and walked through the cold to the jailhouse with her document case under her arm, and a key she had been handed by the territorial marshal, and her own 2 feet carrying her exactly as far as she intended to go. Nora Payne took up every inch of the life, and she did not ask a single soul's permission.